solidarity among working people is the exception and not the rule, and organizers are the freaks. Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Lillian. Here with me today is Gil.
Hello.
Will.
Hey there.
And Owen.
Hey.
So today's episode is called Why Does Class Matter? And it's called that because we read an article, a forthcoming article of mine, where I basically make an argument for why I think class matters. So I'll just tell you a little bit about why I'm asking this question, and then I'll just throw it to the group for their thoughts. So I say in the paper's introduction that it explores what I call an underexamined theme, which is who or what is the working class and what is wrong with the situation that the members of this class share. Now, this might sound like, why am I doing that? Didn't Marx do that a long time ago? And if that is your reaction, one interesting fact is that Marx never really wrote about class, and I intuited that many people in philosophy, especially after the New Left, came into the academy. They sort of thought the class angle of oppression or domination had been resolved, that we knew enough about it because Marx and Marxists had hammered at it for some time. And the idea that I started to intuit in other philosophers was that we've already figured out the class problem. This is the more simple part of the equation. And what is now more complicated and has more depth is to talk about gender and race, and then it was expanded to other forms of domination. And what I write in the paper is that I think that this is actually not the case, that class compared to other forms of oppression is poorly understood. And I argue that what this entails is that the class character of other forms of oppression and or domination, whatever normative language you want to use, is therefore also poorly understood. So it is not possible with the current constraints of the discourse to make sense of why class matters, basically beyond something like inequality. And some of the original feedback that I got on this paper when I started writing it was people were sort of skeptical that I could accuse other radical theorists of having a very narrow and economistic view of class, or that they had a simple view of class, or that they didn't have a very robust understanding of class or political economy, because most radical theorists in the academy, at least until the late 70s, did accept some part of Marx's theory of class, and indeed even later into the 90s, people would pay a sort of due deference to exploitation as a social problem. But as we've discussed on the podcast other times, class and political economy didn't remain a central area of critique, and indeed many philosophers rejected it as an adequate or robust or interesting area of critique. And so I thought that it was about time we brought class back into the equation, and I basically confront what I think are some of the main objections to thinking about class conflict as a source of domination. And I try to ascertain both who I think workers are and why I think they're dominated as a group in a way that is not reducible to the external influences of other forces of domination onto the class structure. So I argue that class divisions are a unique harm for a diverse and interdependent group within capitalist societies, both in spite of and because of differences among group members, and that class matters not just because it creates economic groups in which some are rich and the others are poor, but because competition creates conditions that militate against solidarity toward cleavage and conflict. And class is ultimately something that makes people vulnerable, jointly vulnerable to arbitrary power, specifically workers, and also vulnerable because they have to depend on one another to mitigate and or contest that form of arbitrary power. So I argue that if capitalism inhibits constraints on self-determination, in the sense that it disrupts capacities for collective action, collective capacities for whatever reason, then it's a constraint on self-determination and therefore a source of domination. And then I also had asked the group to read Claus, Offe, and Heimut Wiesenthal's Two Logics of Collective Action to also supplement our discussion. So we'll post that in our episode notes.
So I'll jump in. So I actually want to begin with your article, Lillian, but I really hope we go to the two logics of collective action because, well, that's me going there. But with your article, what I thought was really interesting is that you lay out the idea of, two types of reductionism. And so clearly you're responding to the critique of, class reductionism is the idea that, let's, just for shorthand, I'm going to say race and gender, but obviously we could proliferate what it is, are ignored if you focus on class because it doesn't take into account, and I like that you focus on this language, how race and gender shape these issues. But the other sense of reduction that I thought was really important for your argument that made a lot of sense to me is that, the other problem of reduction is, a conception of class difference that, you're not using the conception of class difference that can shed light on normally salient aspects of other kinds of domination. So what was important there was I thought that, you were pointing out, well, what's happening is creating this inside outside the economy or the market, which is a way of, I hadn't realized, is repurposing neoclassical economics. But it seems to me that the move should be of trying to understand how these contradictions arise within the market, rather than acting like the market is doing what it's doing, and then there's this race and gender stuff that happens, which is another way of creating this either simplification or this division between. So there are issues with the market, but then there are these sort of almost more metaphysical issues with race and gender that need a completely different analysis without actually giving the material grounding for, so why do these contradictions come up? What is their logic and what do they mean? So I thought that was really important, you kind of pushing back into the reductionism of an inside outside and saying, well, let's actually look at what the market is doing. And then we see actually conditions of shared vulnerability, even if, the interests are articulated differently. Which I could then just leap into talking about the collective action article, but I want to start there and say it was really important to me that you overcome or actually just bracket out this inside-outside division around the language of shaping these issues and showing how they arise imminently rather than sort of transcendently imposed. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, you did. I think that the more iconoclastic attempt that I make in this article to critique of class reductionism is exactly that, where I argue that these critiques were meant to create a more robust worldview, but they in fact did not. And they are themselves reductive in a second sense that they don't consider, which is that they continue to think about the economy in a way that is extremely narrow and reductive, and for some reason, metaphysically dissimilar to every other social dynamic in which we live, which is odd, considering the market is something that we confront all day, every day, and is a pretty dominant part of our lives. So yeah, that's one move I make, to say that it's perhaps ideological, to say that there is an inside and an outside to the market, and then the bad stuff gets put in from the outside because, well, that's what neoclassicists think. For neoclassical economics, this shit cannot be the market's fault. It's defined away from the market.
By the way, just real quick, because I've been reading about Hayek. When I read that, it's didn't he have this idea, this ideal understanding that the free market is the best we can do, and it's because things keep meddling in it and shaping it. And I'm like, ooh, that's uncomfortable company for, I think, some radical theorists, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you showed that kind of affinity between the neoclassical economics and some of the kind of current discourses on the left, which would seem, at least implicitly, to, in this idea that, the market in itself it maybe creates some conditions for solidarity amongst white male workers or something, but it can't have a broader solidarity because there are these external non-market forces that are getting in the way, racism and sexism, which are dividing people from one another. And what that presumes is that, and I like the way you put this, right, that it presumes that there are like automatic affinities between any workers, right, let alone white, as if all kind of white male workers had some kind of automatic affinity with one another. And there's a line where you say the labor market guarantees solidarity to no one. And I really, really like that line because it puts the kind of onus on thinking within economic terms and trying to actually understand the economy better and economic determinations better, rather than doing what I think we as theorists would usually rather do, which is to say that, well, there's a kind of background, what's the word you used it for? A tabula...
A tableau.
Oh, that's right. There's a background tableau in which, well, the economy's there, and there are these things that we think about that go in and kind of, I don't know, interrupt or determine or affect the economic sphere. And that's what we're primarily interested in. Because again, like you said at the beginning, the economy's already been accounted for. And like Marxists have already understood, they've already done the work on class. They've already done the work on economy. So what we need to do then is focus on these other vectors of domination and how they interact with this field that we presumably already understand. And I think you go to task on that presumption, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I also like your movement from the focus on inequality to domination, because I took it that
I wanted to
point,
ask about this. Yeah.
do you? Because maybe you should ask your question first before I
Oh no.
mutilate it.
Yeah. Well, no. No, please go ahead.
Okay. So what I was going to say is what I really liked about that is, so I take it that, focusing on inequality, I can actually see, and maybe at some point we'll read some of his work, why, someone maybe in the Adolf Reed, way of thinking about this sees, well, if you focus on that, then it seems like what you think the problem is, how can we create some sort of parity of, and by parity, parity, because obviously parity of the ruling class, you might think I'm about making fun of the ruling class, which I am, but how we can create some sort of parity in the ruling class rather than understanding, there can be unequal outcomes, but that does not and should not obscure a fundamental general domination, structure of domination that's at play. And that, unless you attend to that structure of domination in the labor market, given that workers do not own the means of production, their labor power cannot be, severed from them as if it's a commodity. If you obscure that only focus on inequality, then you actually just abstract away what the market is doing, how it creates these tensions and these conflicts, and make it seem as if we can just rejigger things around and it'll be fine. But if the problem is general domination, then you have to actually think really deeply about what is sort of the causal effect of this inequality, rather than making the inequality the cause, and that's what we need to root out as such.
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that, one of the questions that I had to ask you, Lillian, if you could help clarify, is what is this notion of domination that you're using? Because I think I buy the argument that, as you lay it out and as Will just sort of recapitulated a little bit, that inequality is an inadequate frame or an inadequate way to parse the problem of what's going on in these class conflictual relations, and that domination gets at something important about what this is actually about in material terms, about self-determination.
And is a better normative category, I think, is also the claim.
Right.
Is the claim. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I was wondering if you could help unpack a little bit what you understand by domination and how it's involved in these economic relations.
Yeah, I start using the word domination in the Republican sense, where Republicans think about domination as a capacity, something you can exercise. And normally, and I don't talk about civic virtues in this paper, but they normally talk about capacities in terms of civic virtue, like how much you can... in what ways you can adequately represent your interests as a part of a collective, and presumably this takes some shaping of moral character to be able to do this. And the way that I start talking about domination here is I'm looking at the way capitalism and the labor market specifically, and then more specifically labor market dependency, how it shapes people's epistemic, cognitive, and moral and practical capacities. And I started looking at it and I'm like, holy shit, like this is really an inhibition on everybody's capacities to be able to determine the course of their own lives. And what makes class domination distinct is that people have to do that collectively. Unlike other locations in the capitalist class structure that do not need collective action, like employers who can use collective action, like they can come together opportunistically based on pretty obvious preconceived like goals, so like they're able to talk about their profit margins, the rate of profit. They're able to talk about, what they need to get out of every quarter. And if there's a strike, they're fully united against it, So there's a way in which their interests are rather transparent to themselves for the purposes in which they need to like join up together. Like that's not that complicated.
Or lobbying for policies, right? Political lobbying, which they unite in order to accomplish, right?
Yeah. So like if you notice that as soon as you look at the other side of the equation, well, these capacities are deeply unequal. And that's where I start thinking that this is why it's domination. Because if you need to be able to exert collective power, to be able to determine something about your own life in this society, and the entire social structure sets up constraints, inhibitions, or deterrences for your ability to do that, and not by accident, then what happens is that these capacities are undermined. And the effect is that you're subject to the arbitrary power of employers. And I think that the only way you can see that is from the perspective of the class as a whole. You can see it in terms on micro, like more small scale things like within a sector. So I gave the example of UPS workers and like tiered work, like separating part-time and full-time workers. I think I also used the example of adjuncts and professors. But these are conditions that if you look from the perspective of the whole, you start seeing a mass of people that are very collectively interdependent based on the fact they have to compete with one another and the fact that it's so damn difficult for them to exert any kind of collective power just based on their structural relationship with capital. And that's abstracting away from the legal barriers and so on and so forth. So that's why I think it's domination. Does that help?
It does. I was also reminded when you were talking about this, and in the both in your article and also in the two logics piece of Adam Smith actually makes this point already in The Wealth of Nations, which is kind of wild that it's overlooked, where he talks about like when it comes to the determination of something like wages, what we end up with is a kind of conflictual relation in which like the owners of capital and those who sell their labor are in this sort of antagonistic competition of a sort to try to figure out how this will be, what a reasonable kind of remuneration would look like. And then he says, of course, all of the advantages accrue to the owners of capital. They're fewer in number. Structurally, everything is on their side. The state and the legislative authority just kind of naturally tends to favor them.
Have the cops.
And it's funny that, and the cops are on their side, of course, right? What's funny is he's able to like note this contradiction and doesn't know what to do with it, right? Which is why we need to move beyond him to Marx. But I think it's amazing that it's already there in a way. He's like, of course, it's way harder to get workers together to recognize something like a common set of interests, or even to be able to mobilize concretely in an effective political way on the basis of a recognized shared interest, if we get that far, than it is for just like for owners to just be like, well, all right, we'll just make a couple changes. We've got immediate sort of transparency of interest to ourselves.
Yeah, and what I really loved about the two logics articles, what it clarified for me is that, by taking this viewpoint, it also becomes quite clear, to go all the way back to our first episode, why the logic of like the sort of individual humanism doesn't work, the sort of self-determining person. So there's this great line where it goes to illustrate, quote, the individual worker has hardly any chance of making her avoidance alternative on employment personally more acceptable, nor does she have much leverage for making the employer's preference curve steeper. And so basically what they're saying there is that, when managers and bosses want to do something, they rarely have to actually talk with the people they're going to do it with and be like, hey, are y'all okay with it? Like, obviously, sometimes there are legal mechanisms in place to try to inhibit that. But structurally, as the language that they use it, the bosses and managers, it's monological. They don't actually have to do with the difficult stuff. As if you are a worker, there's a whole lot you can't just do on your own. And the type of organizing that's to happen there is, while managers don't have to really worry about conflicts of needs and all of that, unions can't avoid that problem. They actually have to, the way that I love the way that it's put is, unions are therefore confronted with the task of organizing the entire spectrum of needs that people have when they are employed as wage workers. That is a completely different type of domination than, say, what a manager has to go through, where things are often very streamlined for them, and the whole sort of system is set up to make it very clear, here's what you want, here's how you can get it, and we're going to try to grease it as much as you can. While bringing together wage workers, like, they can have conflictual needs and they are dependent on one another, but they're also thrown against one another to try to accomplish their goals, which means it's going to be a fundamentally different type of maybe we could put sort of political praxis that is necessary. But, so I thought that was like really helpful, that also the domination is how hard it is to get clear on, like, so how do we say what our real interests are? How do we know that they adequately represent us when you have all of these multiple needs flying around? And I just really felt that.
I think that kind of epistemic and moral ambiguity on the part of workers is really important, because one of the reasons I started writing my articles, like when I first read the Two Logics of Collective Action piece, it struck me that, like, this is a response sort of covertly to a lot of criticisms and big mysteries that people launch against class conflict theory, Marxism, the idea that the working class is a political agent, and it doesn't present itself as such. So the first problem is, why don't workers always organize? Like, why don't they unionize? Why aren't they performing the social role that we hope they will, or that we used to hope they will? Well, the answer is very simple, that if you are a wage worker, you have, unless somebody comes along and makes it viable for you, more attractive, more worth taking of the risk to join a collective organization, it makes sense to go it alone. Because the burden of risk on you is so much higher than it is for your employer getting fired. We've always known that it's the risk of getting fired that haunts people, but it's also, why don't they join these collective organizations? Well, because unless someone gives you a concrete, opens that path, makes you think you can take it, that it's realistic, you have no reason to take it, because that you have countervailing interests. Likewise with resource closure, the idea that some workers will hoard skills or jobs, that kind of thing, I try to articulate the conditions under which that becomes attractive, especially as people lose power within collective organizations. And so what I start with the premise that solidarity among working people is the exception and not the rule. And organizers are the freaks. Organizers are the altruists. And this is something I learned from Vivek Chibber when I first read the Two Logics of Collective Action. I remember him standing up at the board, and he made this like U-shaped, like, those, you can tell I don't know how to do math or statistics, but those like statistical curves where they show you like the norm with the hump in the middle? Like the normative, the normative distribution or whatever. He drew that on the board, and he was like, you have to understand, most people are here in the middle. You people, because we're all a bunch of like socialists in his class, he was like, you people are all the way over here. You're on the right-hand side. You are not normal. Get that through your head. And I remember him pointing at, you are not normal. And I was like, you're a total freak. But this is true, because the motivation, like, organizers are different. They're people who they want to organize you, but it's your job to make it attractive to people to join your organization. And that's not going to just come naturally. So the idea that people think that there's some kind of automatic affinity among workers, whatever their identities, I think is misplaced, and it's led to a lot of misunderstandings of what is going on here. And I think it actually mystifies the further step that would allow you to identify where something like racism or xenophobia does come from endogenously to the labor process based on different patterns of migration, different local histories, and so on.
So I know we're gonna get to that this like question of this like how to functionally or how to understand the functional coordination or like dialectical imbrication of things like race and class. But before we do, I think kind of getting to some of what you were just talking about, one of the things you lay out in the article, which I think is really helpful, is like these two different kinds of social theory in general. And one of them is like stratification theory and the other is class conflict. And so I think you helpfully kind of talk about what the sort of apparent benefits or attractions to both of them are. Obviously, you come down on the side of class conflictual social theory. Could you talk a little bit about what the stratification theory is and why you think the class theory is better?
Yeah, the stratification theory is basically the mainstream way of thinking about class in sociology. So most if you study inequality in a sociology department or that discipline at large, you're mostly doing stratification. And what that is trying to create justifications for how you think inequality, like the state of inequality in a given population, usually a country, but also could be the world. The difference between stratification theories and class conflict theories is that stratification theories don't think of class as a categorical variable. It's something that can have an infinite number of gradational types. So like it could be determined by income, by education. And in fact, if you even want to study class in the US, you have to study it based on proxy things like education, which is why you'll get a lot of socialists in academia talking about the people with or without high school degrees, because it's the only way to approximate who might be working class in this literature, because there's no statistics kept based on the kind of categorical variable that you would think about in terms of being working class, like relationship to the means of production. So it can have an infinite number of gradational types because it's really up to the theorist, like what they want to know about reality that tells them what categories they should use to understand that reality. And for Marxists, this is not appropriate because, I think that there are actual concrete social positions that are not arbitrary, that I'm trying to understand how these social relationships work, evolve, and develop over time. And it's not just up to me to make these designations. And I think that I think it's a better way of understanding reality, but there's a fair disagreement. Some people just don't think that's true.
But you do pose, right, if I get this right, a definition of class that opposes that kind of stratification understanding of it, which is totally individual and not categorical, because you define it as dependency on the labor market, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a little different the way that I do it from the way that I think other Marxists have done it, because I think there's this misconception that class is the same thing as an identity or a type of job or occupation. There's this preoccupation in literature that's critical of Marxism with the white male industrial worker. And I have been asking myself for years, why are people preoccupied with this person? The working class that I know, at least that I observe, is not a white male industrial worker, but the argument was that just because the demographics and the job classifications and the type of work people were doing changed, that Marxism was no longer relevant because people didn't work in these factories anymore and they didn't have this particular job category. And I'm like, that was never the view. It was never the view. If you think about capitalism as a conflictual system that evolves and changes, and again, that's why I talk about real competition, which is closer, and where Sheikh has corrected me, it's not opposed to all classical economics. It's actually closer to classical economics but it's a rejection of neoliberalism, neoclassical economics. The idea that capitalism would just stay stagnant and that the working class would just be these industrial people, it was just never a part of the methodology, and I just don't really understand how that got caught up in the rejection of class theory, but it did. So that's why I brought it up.
And I think that's a big part of the reason why class is generally dismissed, at least or doesn't seem to spark the same kind of curiosity in the degree of work or the departments dedicated to understanding it or any of that. It's partly because the kind of paradigmatic working class person, I still think in a lot of people's minds, whether they're aware of it or not, is this kind of white, factory working male who I think many people perceive to have achieved a place in civil society that doesn't require the kind of, that doesn't require the kind of work that we're called to do when we think about other kinds of oppression, which seem more salient, more urgent, more vicious, right? At one point you say that the market, like working, being dependent on the market or the marketplace starts to seem almost like a kind of benign, like a benign social force, like the market, right? Compared to these other social forces, which obviously are really bad, right? But patriarchy or white supremacy, right? But there's a sense in which I don't know. I think maybe because of that paradigmatic figure of the worker, which is not adequate to the actual social situation that we face, there's a tendency to not maybe sense the same urgency for thinking about class.
And I'd just like to make maybe a meta-theoretical point about what is happening there is I think, there's a strange way in which the best, language I have for it is a certain cultural imaginary has seeped into social theory as if it's social theory. And what I'm thinking about is, even when we're talking about the working class, when I see people, talk about that, usually what they're just talking about are their imagined significations of what it means to be working class. 100%. So they'll mention pickup truck, trucker hat, or things that quite, construction, yeah, which and then they impute these sort of moral valuations on the types of people they imagine do those things, and that seems to add more grist to the mill to be like, so enough of this focus on class, because clearly all y'all are focused on are these people that we've decided are morally reprehensible, what have you. And what I find strange there is it just shows how a type of imagination offers itself as if it's sociological analysis, which means we get further and further away from understanding, if I understand your view, Lillian, understanding class as a process rather than just a bunch of contingent identities a body might be having on itself.
Yeah, I mean, if I were gonna say some of the most important strategic sectors to organize right now, I would talk about almost primarily logistics. That you can't possibly make the argument that that's a predominantly white workforce, healthcare workers dominated by women, So,
food service.
Yeah, I agree. I've found this I've actually found myself almost kind of snapping at people at times because I'd be talking about class and they would start, kind of. The accusation of class reductionism comes pretty quickly if you talk about class at all. So I found myself in situations where I wanted to just snap at people and be like, okay, for some reason, when I think class, you think white, even though they think they're making the opposite. Yeah, even though they think they're saying that to me in reverse. But it just be one of the motivations for writing this paper is I just realized I was developing a conception of class that was really alien to the way that is common sense. So I was no longer on the same page with people about what class was, and therefore I needed to write about it. Otherwise, that was never going to resolve itself.
It's important. People think Trump's base is working class, even though we know that they are overwhelmingly petit bourgeois. But that speaks to the kind of paradigmatic imagination rather than a kind of sociological analysis or something, an imagination of what the working class is.
Yeah, and I also feel like that as a sociological category has almost been evaporated from public discourse and all of that. To understand these different types of class relations and all of that. But I also wanted to ask you, Lillian, about your paper, your explicit what did you call it? Practical theoretical approach. Did I get that right?
Practice theoretical, right?
Practice theoretical.
Yeah.
I'm someone who was a big fan of this. So, I like this way that you talk about the normative structuring of a practice. So basically, it seems like what you're trying to do is like, let's stop just, doing all of this sort of idealizing and imagining, and actually let's get into the guts of what one would, have to do in order to have the success of solving a particular problem, and what resources one has for identifying what they have to do to solve a problem or not. And so, of course, when you're thinking about, use this example of someone trying to sell perfume or something.
I love this.
Some people, yeah, I thought that was great. That because you had a way of showing also how norms can arise endogenously from a particular structure of what that practice is and what counts as success, rather than from being imaginarily imposed. And so I also take this to be as a correction of how you say we ought to do social theory. That social theory that starts from these abstract idealizations of what goes on, ends up eclipsing all of these ways we can understand how norms arise and what it means to solve problems, which makes it very practical, not just in the way that you're using it, but pragmatic insofar as if you want people to join an organization, you have to be able to make the case that you're going to be able to solve the problems that they have, that there's going to be some success that they can understand and be able to weigh like, oh yes, this makes sense. Stop me if I'm wrong, but
No,
that's
you're
kind of
totally right. I'm glad that you're into the practice theoretical thing. I mean, it's certainly just a more pragmatic take, and my hope is really that that it will kind of rectify some of the problems with the level of abstraction that a lot of structuralist accounts have when it comes to describing these phenomena. And I just think it's long overdue, because these kinds of accounts of like getting into the nitty-gritty of daily experience of other kinds of oppressions are well established. And people will often talk about class, but because they don't go into any detail, they'll be like, okay, of course, these are the material conditions, but then like there are these discourses, and then there are norms, and then there are identities. And at a certain point, I'm like, wait a minute, but like class isn't doing any of the work except for being like a general situation that is underspecified. And the reason that this is a problem is that, I mean, it's analytically a problem, but I also think that it causes a great deal of unfortunate projection onto people who are in a pretty different situation. Like it's possible for, I think, theoreticians to be able to like, create models to the best of our knowledge. Like we have to not only speak about ourselves, but working people like may or may not have the same preoccupations that we do, the same commitments, because people like we have spent years of our lives coming up with our systems. Consistency of thought is like basically our job. And it's the job of a lot of professional class people, of culturally, like people who are in the creative and thinking industries, whatever. You have the time to kind of like learn to put all of the ducks in a row. Now, part of the problem with class is that it's very difficult to imagine a situation in which you have you may or may not have that integrated of a normative and cultural worldview. You have different incentives. You might, like some people might be very religious, it might be very systematic. Some people, I'm not saying that people don't have a systematic worldview, but if there are these cognitive defects, right, kind of problems in developing solidarity in the workplace and for the class as a whole, then there are going to be ways in which like that kind of differing interests in the same situation, different perspectives on the same situation, different reasons for taking one strategy or another, unless you try to actually look at it and say what would be reasonable under these circumstances, then I don't think you're going to get very far. You're just going to project onto them the things that you kind of hope they think, or that you would that seem consistent with something else that you're more familiar with. And unfortunately, I think the class divide and what that kind of workspace is like is actually something that's more alien to researchers than they like to admit.
I just want to jump in real quick because I want to throw out something that is a personal interest to me, especially when you have this line about for Rahel Yegi, a problem is objective and subjective. And in that moment, I thought about the text that everyone wants to talk about whenever they talk about race, which is Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. He has that famous line, that unasked question, what does it feel like to be a problem, which is subjective. And then there's the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Okay, I'm not going where you think I'm going. Where I'm going is what is sort of like a vanishing process in Souls of Black Folk, which is unfortunate because it's taken up as this sort of seminal text I think has also affected an articulation of Black politics, is class. There's a real problem with the talented 10th, where Du Bois clearly thinks the talented 10th have realized, oh, subjectively, I feel like a problem. Oh, now I know the objective problem. But then, he has this story where this talented 10th guy, named John, he goes down south and he tries to organize, his Black kin down there, but he just thinks that they're a bunch of dummies, and all that John is really offering them is you all should read Shakespeare. What are you all doing still going to your backwards church? And is shocked that they just don't care or listen to him. And it's because he can't actually, one, articulate what their problems are, and two, he clearly doesn't even understand, what their issues are and what they value and what would be success for them. And so I wanted to bring that up because I thought it was a really interesting way to critique I love Du Bois. Let me just be very clear. I love Du Bois, but was a foundational text of how we think about leadership and organizing. And that, really what you have going on there is, why in the world would that work? Where you don't even try to understand, so what are the endogenous issues that are arising? You're just trust me, I'll take care of it. Why would anyone do that? You don't even understand the situation. So I just wanted to make that connection between your problem solving, because that doesn't solve a problem. Why would anyone trust you?
Yeah, that's another example of treating a group like a sociological object, which you think you can understand by their kind of objective position vis-a-vis a power structure, rather than what I take to be the kind of practice theoretical approach, which resists that kind of structural approach to understanding oppression or domination, which seeks to actually enter what you call the kind of normative texture of how it is that people that are in positions of domination experience and navigate that domination. And I think the promise that is that, well, the objective view of social groups didn't deliver, the view, for example, that, well, there's something that will automatically unite people that are proletarianized, and eventually there'll be class solidarity and we'll have a revolution, right? I think the real promise of that is that, I think one of your claims, implicitly at least, is that the political potential of this practice theoretical model is much richer than the political potential of the kind of sociologically objectifying structuralist approach to understanding what a class position is.
Yeah, I think so. I'm definitely still, pro class politics, but what I'm hoping to contribute is just a little more of a realistic understanding of what those politics can and should look like, and how over time they change. There's the problem of labor unions. Once they're successful, institutionalization is something that they have to do, but they will run into the various attempts of the state and of their representatives, who need to make themselves continuously relevant as brokers, for the union with other parts of the political parties or the state. And so there's a kind of as soon as something's institutionalized in that way, there can be a parting of ways between the collective membership and their activity and the representation. And I think what I'm just trying to contribute is that we have to stop looking for shortcuts for this stuff. It's not sufficient to say that the working class will just do it eventually. They won't. They might not, honestly. But there's a normative argument, which is what I'm starting to build, for why they should. And you can either buy that or not buy that, but I'm trying to make my case. And for people who want to resist class politics, my question for them is simply, is there what's your alternative, and is it going to be able to form the same sorts of collective interest that I'm putting forth here? And there might be multiple sources of collective interest, but now at least I've got on the table substantively what that is, which is why at the end of it, I'm they have a claim to self-determination, and then now we can actually put it into conversation with other claims, because if the claim is just like, we want less inequality or we want a revolution in the abstract, well, like, so do we all, so or not,
join
I
the
don't
club,
know.
okay,
the
whatever.
club.
I mean, I don't know if I want revolution. I just want to be happier. And maybe revolution is the necessary condition for that, but I just want a little more happiness in the world. That's it. That's all. I actually, I don't know if you all want to go a different route, but I thought the turning towards the two logics article might help, because it seems like a natural place to go to. Now that we're talking about, when unions emerge, eventually they have to institutionalize, and it seemed as if part of the argument near the end of the article is that, unions find themselves under pressure from, they need to survive and they need to show that they can be successful. And what eventually happens by being absorbed institutionally is the imperative to survive starts to override, actually being successful. And so what seemed to be going on here is that they're also giving a really realist argument of, why organizing is so difficult. I like that, they, brought up hey, guess what? When you get more members in a union, you need that to survive. It also makes things harder. And I wonder if sometimes we romanticize the idea of let's just build mass power and boom, baby, there you got it. But then this starts getting into the guts of, there are going to be conflicts between members and leaders, between leaders feeling this needs to carry on. And as it's absorbed, it develops a sort of dependence on the institution that's absorbed into. And that institution is going to have some terms that it wants you to abide by, which means don't succeed too much. Let's be, very clear. And so I thought, that was a really, provocative way of trying to again, getting rid of the romanticism, getting back to the realism of how difficult, or to use the language used, how there are not shortcuts to these political practices.
One of the interesting things that kind of analysis highlights, I think, is that there's actually a really important difference between the reason for being for an institution or an organization and how it maintains itself or continues to exist, right? And so these things get blurred together sort of uncritically when we talk or act as though the fact that there does need to be some kind of organization of or a collective interest is how and why these organizations or unifying projects do their work. And the truth of the matter is, as you were just saying, Will, and as they point out in the article, that no, those are actually extremely different kinds of reasons, and they're very, very different processes that are often conflictual, right? I mean, in other words, at the limit, we end up with situations sometimes where the way in which an institution is able to continue to exist is by contradicting certain elements of that interest or end in the first place. That's the extreme limit here.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to show that there are limits. There's a way in which I think the argument that in the Two Logics of Collective Action article, the argument it's pushing against is, the voluntarist one, that if the people involved were just more tougher, more politically astute, less susceptible to co-optation by the establishment, more just more principled, whatever it is, Mm-hmm. And the argument is just no, man, that's not what's happening here, because there's a couple of problems. I mean, in the first place, what you're saying, Gil, is trade unions have to remain relevant to their members. So they have to not only demand things that their employers can actually provide. If you demand too much from your employer, first of all, you're not going to win, because they're not going to do anything that drives them out of business. So then you're going to delegitimize yourself in the face of your membership. And then they're going to lose trust in you. They're not going to be as engaged. And then if you were to demand too much also, there's a structural reason for that. Employers can't give you everything that you need in order and still stay employers. So this class conflict has a real strong micro dynamic. And in order to kind of be the legitimate partners at the bargaining table with management, labor has to discipline its membership. And so I think there was a kind of sometimes romantic view of the labor movement, not among the many critics I raised in my own article, but among, I think, people on the left. But what I'm kind of interested in doing is a kind of save and rescue. Like, nonetheless, collective action gets the goods. So, instead of being
Nothing else can.
Right. Yeah. Instead of being romantic about it, let's just, think about it more straightforwardly.
Yeah, and that romanticism seeps into even, I think, the way people think about how to resist that ossification of unions, right? Which you mentioned, right? Which is that, I've seen a lot personally of kind of romanticization of wildcat strikes, which there are many that I've loved, and that I think have an incredibly important strategic function. But
Some of my best friends are wildcat strikes.
there you go. but like you said, there's no shortcuts.
A new
right?
stage in the culture war.
No. But yeah, there's no shortcuts. I mean, that you still have to reckon with that kind of nitty-gritty question of organizing, of adjudicating all of these differences, of trying to build something more durable than just what, a wildcat strike offers. And that's just one example of where I think that kind of shortcut happens.
So this is like, a thing that, as you all know from, our group chat, I've been thinking about, which is, collective action gets the goods, but it seems as if, something that happens, especially when labor organizations eventually have to discipline their members, is that this can start to lead to a lack of trust between the members and the leaders. And so I guess I have two separate questions. One is about your article, and one is maybe about how this could happen in practice. One, I think as you said, you're making a normative argument for self-determination. And so it's like, part of what you are offering with this, article is, it actually is important to have a vision of why we ought to do this, rather than it being like, I guess this is a thing one could do, or this is a thing that happens to occur. And two, I'm not expecting us to come up with like the easy answers in the nitty gritty, but do you all agree that with, this normative call for self-determination, that, trust in a collective action group is necessary? Or is that simply, it's nice if that happens, but there'll be other overriding factors that will do that work? And if not, how can the resources, the normative resources for trust towards self-determination be renewed? Because I was taking from the co-authored article Logics is that, they were saying we can see rationally why opportunism would happen in a labor organization. And I've realized that there's something really interesting when they're saying this is actually reasonable. This isn't like about sellouts or, when they start to depend on an institution, that's because they weren't tough enough. Maybe in individual cases that might be the case, but they're saying I can lay out structurally why it's rational to do that. But then this ossification sets in, and the trust starts to wean down. And I'm not saying like, sort of metaphysically, but because there are structural factors that are making it difficult to keep that trust in place. So what do we do with that issue? What is our responsibility as theorists? That's why I'm asking. Like, I'm not saying we need to like say lay out here's our 10-step plan, but it seems like that should at least be on the agenda. That is not something one can just avoid. It's not a contingent problem. It seems to be like a necessary contradiction, if I can put it that way, that one encounters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. I mean, in practice, like at least for the labor movement, there's efforts towards reform caucuses and so on and so forth, like rank and file members who want to change their union. But more concretely, in terms of just generally building up workplace organizations or any organizations, people have to have a common project. They actually have to have some stakes. And I feel like one of the things that's kind of missing in a lot of the abstract questions that people ask in like philosophy workshops about coalition building or whatever is like, what are people's interests? Like, is there something that they're actually like interested in like fighting for together? Or are we just like in a moral conglomeration that's like generally opposed to things? And that's pretty much what it sounds like most of the time. And the problem is that if you want to build relationships among people who don't have a stake in being seen in like the correct moral light or whatever, like who just don't find that to be like the relevant thing they want to do, you've got to like have something that they need and try to figure out how they can work together to build it. And I just finished Cedric Johnson's book, From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, where he was talking about the Black Power movement and some of its own dynamics of elite capture. And he has this formulation where he talks about class politics based on situated class experiences. Like, he kind of raises that often and he raises the example of some people in New Orleans who were trying to get this disgusting corporation to not build a plant near them, the neighborhood got together to resist these people, like this corporation, from coming to their community. And some of them even went to Japan. It was a Japanese corporation. They went over there, but, and they won. And he just talks about everyone there had an interest in these people not coming to town. And they got together, and I don't remember all the little steps, but they wrote petitions. Part of it is they got that Japanese company to invite some of them over there, and it was a multiracial group, a group that had a very strong, Jim Crow legacy. And he argues that part of what this did is it created some healing for that community. He doesn't romanticize this, but he's having a common goal, something tangible. People start to see each other in a different light when they're making progress towards something like that. They don't build trust if what's being expected of you is that you subscribe to a set of norms or principles that you don't right away identify with, because you don't see the payoff in doing that.
What I really love about this, and this is near the end of your article, and this is kind of what I see maybe the meta work that articles like this do. You start focusing on, I don't know if this was intentional, but it seems like it really falls from the argument of the role that learning plays in these movements. Yeah. You have this line, and you're talking about how, the red baiting McCarthy era and deindustrialization started to break these labor movements apart. Quote, if one combines this repression, red baiting McCarthy era, with the onset of deindustrialization, then what emerges is a labor movement that was unable to transmit a learning process in which solidarity had emerged as a counterculture, end quote. And so what I think is also really interesting to reflect on is a more sort of diachronic view of how do we continue transmitting, what are the concrete processes in which trust could emerge so that collective action could be effective. But when we lose that learning part, when we lose that sort of cultivation of the future of what you're handing down, then, to go back to, our favorite guy, it seems like Stark describes in Critique of Dialectical Reason of how, groups come together, and then eventually through institutionalization, they become what he calls serial, which is, separate but together. And I just think the learning process, not to sound too Hegelian, but might be something you'd want to keep handing down to, another set of circumstances, to amass that. So that's not you have to rebuild it from the ground floor each and every time, which seems like such a fatal problem if time is not infinite, to deal with the problems that we may have.
I mean, I think that's totally where we're at right now. I mean, I think that the learning process was broken down. That's what neoliberalism did. And so now we build abstract ideals of how we could all be in solidarity together, but it's not, that pathway isn't clear. And I think what's often forgotten is that it was generations of people that built up those capacities together. There's all kinds of stories, for example, of people who were part of the labor movement in Germany, the SPD in its heyday. When they came over to the US, these were the most militant trade union fighters, the Finns, they as well. They showed up and they were ready to go. And they were not seen as integrated into the social life. They were seen as foreigners. They were seen as, dirty communist, aliens, whatever. But they had this experience. Likewise, in a totally different context, I guess I was reading about East Germany recently, which is why I'm thinking about these different ways in which these people moved across the world. But after the Second World War, in East Germany, there was this big uprising in 1953 against the new regime. And it was this huge huge wave of strikes and trade union organizations. And the author that I read, Gareth Dale, he describes how the most plausible explanation for this is that this is the cadre of the SPD from the pre-war years that remembered. Like, they're the same people. And they're the people who either were in the resistance, went underground, in whatever way survived the war, and they're in East Germany now, and they had the institutional memory and the cadre and the infrastructure to be able to pull off these strikes. And over time, in East Germany, that tanked. Like, that wasn't a model that was able to continue. But it's that kind of thing that I think we should start thinking about, and thinking less in terms of like, I mean, we need to have policy proposals and so on, but given the low level of organization that the American population is at, particularly workers, there needs to be a much more sober look at like, what are the things that can be done to build these relationships and build these institutions. And the problem is that it's not sexy. It doesn't seem like a freedom struggle when you're sitting down and having some annoying conversation with your coworker that is awkward, that you've never had before, and so on. So, all right, I think that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at @LeftOfPhil. If you like what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.